I still have that yellow violation notice folded inside the same old metal box my grandfather handed to my dad, and my dad eventually handed to me. Every once in a while, I pull it out just to remind myself how close a bunch of strangers came to convincing themselves they could erase almost 200 years of family history with a few sheets of paper and a fake sense of authority. The funny part is, they honestly believed they were the good guys, right up until the day their entire operation started collapsing around them. My name is Mason Brooks. I run a cattle ranch about 40 miles outside Sheridan, Wyoming, land that's been in my family since the 1850s. Out here, nobody cares what kind of mailbox you own or whether your fence matches your neighbor's. We wave when we pass each other, help pull trucks out of the mud after a storm. And if someone's barn catches fire, everybody shows up before the volunteer department even gets there. That's the kind of place I grew up in. And because of that, I never imagined I'd spend weeks fighting an HOA I didn't even belong to. It started on an ordinary Tuesday morning. I had just finished checking a section of fence after a windstorm rolled through the night before. My border collie, Scout, was riding beside me in the old ranch truck with his head hanging out the window, while the sun was just starting to burn through the morning fog. As I pulled back toward the front entrance, something bright caught my eye. A thick yellow envelope had been zip-tied to my front gate. At first, I figured maybe the county had left some paperwork about road maintenance. Instead, I found a formal notice demanding payment of $15,000 for multiple HOA violations, including unauthorized livestock, unapproved agricultural structures, excessive equipment noise, and failure to maintain community aesthetic standards. I actually laughed out loud. Scout looked at me like I'd lost my mind. I remember saying, "Buddy, I think somebody drove to the wrong ranch." But the more I read, the less funny it became. The notice threatened additional penalties, legal action, and eventually a lien against my property if I didn't comply within 30 days. There was even a payment plan attached, almost like they expected I'd just shrug and start mailing checks. I called the number listed on the letter. The receptionist transferred me twice before I finally reached a man who introduced himself as Darren Holt, the compliance director. He sounded like the kind of guy who believed talking slowly automatically made him smarter than everyone else. I told him there had to be some mistake because my ranch wasn't part of any homeowners association. He didn't even pause before saying, "According to our records, your property falls under the Cedar Ridge Community Association. Every parcel in that district is required to comply." I asked if he could email me a jurisdiction map. Silence. Then a little chuckle. "Sir, that's not really necessary. The records have already been verified," I said. "Verified by who?" He answered, "By professionals." That word stuck with me because whenever somebody says professionals instead of naming an actual person, they're usually hiding something. I tried once more to stay polite. "Listen, I'm not trying to argue with you. I just want to understand why an HOA thinks it controls a working cattle ranch that's been here since before your subdivision even existed." He sighed like I was wasting his time. "Mr. Brooks, refusing to cooperate isn't going to help you. Plenty of people say they don't belong until they realize the legal consequences." Then he added something that flipped a switch inside me. "If your family really owned that land as long as you claim, they should have taught you to read contracts." I didn't answer for a couple seconds. Finally, I said, "My grandfather taught me something better than that." "What's that?" he asked. "Keep every piece of paper anyone ever signs." I hung up before he could respond. That afternoon, I climbed into the attic above the ranch office where my father kept an old gray steel file box. Dust covered the lid, but inside everything was perfectly organized. Original deeds, survey maps, railroad easement agreements, property patents, tax records, even handwritten notes from my great-grandfather explaining where the original stone boundary markers had been placed generations earlier. My father used to joke that paper outlives memory, and sitting there flipping through documents older than every person I'd ever met, I realized exactly what he meant. Still, I wasn't about to trust my own opinion over certified evidence. The next morning, I called a licensed surveyor named Caleb Morrison. He'd worked all over northern Wyoming for almost 30 years and had a reputation for being painfully thorough. When I explained the situation, he was quiet for a moment before saying, "Something doesn't smell right. Mason, I'll bring the GPS equipment and we'll find out exactly what's going on." 3 days later, he arrived with 2 assistants carrying tripods, drones, historical plats, and equipment that looked expensive enough to launch satellites. Watching them work was fascinating. They weren't just measuring fences. They were comparing federal records, county plats, elevation markers, and original survey monuments buried decades ago. On the evening of the second day, Caleb leaned against his truck, rubbed the back of his neck, and looked at me with the kind of expression that tells you somebody has found something interesting but wants to double-check before saying it out loud. I had no idea that by this point the story wasn't really about my ranch anymore. It was about to expose something much bigger than either of us had imagined. The next morning, Caleb asked me to meet him near the old cottonwood tree that had marked the western edge of our ranch for as long as anyone in my family could remember. He was holding a tablet in one hand and an old folded survey map in the other, and before he even spoke I could tell something wasn't adding up. "You were right," he finally said. "Actually, you were more right than either of us expected." He zoomed in on the GPS map until individual boundary coordinates appeared across the screen. "Your property isn't barely outside the HOA. It's almost 900 feet outside their legal jurisdiction." I stared at the screen for several seconds, expecting there to be some catch. "So they've been sending violations to the wrong address?" Caleb slowly shook his head. "Not just the wrong address. They've been enforcing rules on land they have absolutely no authority over." Hearing those words didn't make me angry right away. It made me curious. Mistakes happen. Survey records can be confusing, but something about Darren's confidence during that phone call kept echoing in my head. He hadn't sounded uncertain. He hadn't even been willing to look at a map. That wasn't carelessness. That was certainty without verification. And that's usually where expensive problems begin. Caleb wasn't finished. He opened another layer on the map showing neighboring parcels. "Want to see something interesting?" A dozen highlighted properties appeared around mine. I checked several neighboring tracts because I couldn't believe what I was seeing. At least 11 more properties appear to be outside the HOA boundaries, yet they're listed in the association's enforcement records. I looked at him. "You're kidding." Wish I was. Suddenly that yellow violation notice didn't feel personal anymore. It felt systematic. That afternoon I drove into town and met my attorney, Rachel Bennett, a former Air Force JAG officer who had built a reputation for taking apart complicated property disputes one document at a time. She listened without interrupting while I spread Caleb's reports across her conference table. She didn't smile when she finished reading. She didn't frown either. She simply reached for a yellow legal pad and started writing. "Mason," she finally said, "if these surveys hold up, this isn't an HOA dispute. This is unauthorized enforcement, fraudulent collection attempts, possible slander of title, and potentially civil extortion if they knowingly threatened liens without legal authority." "Knowingly?" I asked. Rachel leaned back in her chair. "That's what we need to prove. Negligence costs money. Intent changes everything." Within 48 hours, she filed preservation notices demanding the HOA retain every email, board meeting minute, survey record, enforcement file, payment ledger, and communication related to my property. We didn't threaten them. We didn't send emotional letters. We simply requested documents. That's usually when people who have something to hide begin making mistakes. 3 days later, Rachel called me laughing. I had never heard her laugh in a legal case before. "What's so funny?" I asked. "They just scheduled an emergency board meeting. Isn't that normal?" "Not after receiving preservation notices. That means they're scared." Through discovery, we eventually learned what happened behind those closed doors. One board member reportedly asked a simple question: "Did anyone actually verify these boundaries?" According to later testimony, the room went completely silent. Darren admitted he had relied on an outdated development map that had been circulating for years. No certified survey, no county verification, no title review. Just an old marketing plat created before the subdivision was even fully approved. Even worse, nobody on the board had ever checked his work because they assumed he knew what he was doing. I almost felt sorry for them. Almost. Then Rachel showed me something that erased whatever sympathy I had left. Payment records. Homeowners who weren't actually homeowners had been paying fines for years simply because fighting an HOA sounded more expensive than writing a check. One retired couple had paid nearly $8,000 over landscaping violations on land the HOA couldn't regulate. Another ranch owner tore down a perfectly legal equipment shed because he believed he had no choice. One widow had signed a payment agreement after being threatened with foreclosure, even though the association couldn't legally place a lien against her property. That one hit me hard. My own mother had handled paperwork alone after Dad passed away. I kept thinking about someone intimidating her with legal jargon while pretending they had authority they never possessed. That's when the case became personal again. Rachel suggested contacting the other affected owners, but she warned me not to pressure anyone. "Give them facts," she said. "People deserve to decide for themselves." The first call was awkward. The second was emotional. By the fifth conversation, I noticed the same pattern. Every single person began by saying, "I thought I was the only one." One rancher named Eli actually apologized to me for complaining about the HOA years earlier. "I figured you thought I was exaggerating," I told him. "Looks like both of us underestimated them." Within a week, 13 property owners gathered inside the back room of an old volunteer fire station because it was the only place large enough for everyone to sit together. Some brought binders. Others carried grocery bags full of receipts, violation notices, photographs, certified letters, and canceled checks. Nobody had coordinated their stories beforehand, yet every timeline fit together like puzzle pieces. Different addresses, different excuses, same methods. The more we talked, the clearer the pattern became. The HOA always targeted people living on the edge of the subdivision where property descriptions were more complicated and county maps weren't easily understood by average homeowners. They counted on confusion. They counted on intimidation. Most of all, they counted on people deciding it was cheaper to comply than to investigate. Rachel walked into that meeting carrying 2 banker boxes. She placed them on the table and said, "Ladies and gentlemen, congratulations. You are no longer 13 separate complaints. You're one very organized lawsuit." You could almost feel the mood shift across the room. For months, even years, everyone had been isolated, embarrassed, frustrated, unsure whether anyone would believe them. Suddenly, they weren't alone anymore. They were witnesses in the same story. The lawsuit was filed less than a week later. The local paper picked it up first with a small article buried near the middle of the newspaper. Then a regional television station called asking for interviews after obtaining copies of the surveys through public records. Rachel advised us not to celebrate. "Public attention doesn't win lawsuits," she reminded me. "Evidence does." She was right, but public attention changes behavior. Almost overnight, the HOA stopped issuing new violation notices. Their attorney requested extensions. Board members quietly removed their names from community newsletters. Darren's phone number disappeared from the association website. One afternoon, while feeding cattle, I noticed an unfamiliar pickup slowly rolling toward my front gate. Darren climbed out wearing sunglasses and carrying what looked like a folder under his arm. He forced a smile that never reached his eyes. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "I was hoping maybe we could work something out privately." I folded my arms and waited. "The board is prepared to withdraw your violations immediately if you'll agree to resolve this without involving everyone else." There it was. Not an apology, not an admission, just an offer to save themselves. I asked one question. "What about the other families?" His smile disappeared. "This discussion concerns your property." I looked back toward the pasture where generations of my family's work stretched all the way to the horizon. Then I thought about the widow, the retired couple, the rancher who lost his shed, and every person sitting inside that fire station believing they had finally been heard. I shook my head. "Then we're done talking." Darren muttered something under his breath as he walked back to his truck. But before he closed the door, he turned around one last time and said, "You're making a very expensive mistake." I couldn't help smiling because for the first time since finding that yellow notice on my gate, I realized he wasn't talking to me anymore. He was talking to himself, even if he didn't know it yet. The trial itself never turned into the dramatic courtroom showdown people imagined from television because, by the time depositions were finished, the evidence had already done most of the talking. Every survey matched. Every county record matched. Every property description matched. The only things that didn't match were the HOA's claims. During discovery, Rachel uncovered internal emails that changed everything. Months before my violation notice was ever attached to my gate, one board member had actually questioned whether the association's boundary map was accurate. Instead of ordering a new survey, someone replied that verifying every parcel would cost too much money and would only create unnecessary problems. Reading that sentence made my stomach turn because those unnecessary problems became very real for 13 families who lost money, time, and peace of mind simply because someone wanted to save a few $1,000s. Then another document surfaced showing the association had collected tens of thousands of dollars in fines from properties it never legally controlled. That was the moment settlement negotiations changed completely. Their attorney stopped arguing that the HOA had authority and started arguing that everyone involved had acted in good faith. The judge didn't seem impressed. He asked one simple question during a hearing. "If you are uncertain about your jurisdiction, why were you threatening liens against private property?" Nobody answered immediately. You could almost hear the silence filling the courtroom. Less than 3 weeks after we filed the lawsuit, the HOA requested mediation. Rachel looked at me before we walked into the conference room and quietly said, "Remember, justice isn't revenge. Justice is making sure this never happens again." I carried those words with me the entire day. By sunset, the agreement was finished. I received $127,000 covering damages, legal expenses, lost business, emotional distress, and punitive compensation. The other 12 families reached their own settlements as part of the class action, bringing the total payout to well over $1 million. It wasn't just the money that broke the association. Their insurance carrier refused to cover intentional enforcement outside legal authority. Reserve funds disappeared almost overnight. Special assessments couldn't legally be imposed because homeowners were already demanding resignations. Within 2 months, the state appointed an outside administrator to oversee the association's finances. And before the end of the year, the HOA was formally dissolved. The compliance director quietly surrendered his professional certification after investigators concluded he had repeatedly issued enforcement actions without verifying jurisdiction. Several board members resigned before their terms expired. One former president eventually filed for personal bankruptcy after separate financial investigations revealed he had approved improper reimbursements, benefiting himself while ignoring repeated requests for independent boundary verification. None of that brought my father's time back or erased the weeks I spent wondering whether someone could really threaten land my family had cared for across generations. But it did prove something he used to tell me when I was a kid, walking fence lines beside him. Truth doesn't always travel fast, son. But once it catches a lie, the lie has nowhere left to run. A few weeks after everything ended, I climbed back into the attic and opened that same gray steel box again. The original deed was still there, yellowed with age but perfectly preserved. This time, I placed the settlement agreement beside it. One document represented the day my family first earned this land. The other represented the day we defended it without firing a shot, raising a voice, or breaking the law. Sometimes visitors notice the framed papers hanging side by side in my ranch office and ask why I keep them together. I always smile and tell them they're really telling the same story. One shows how something valuable is built. The other reminds me how easily people will try to take it when they assume nobody is paying attention. As for Darren, I honestly don't know where life took him after everything fell apart. Maybe he found another job. Maybe he learned something from all this. I hope he did, because power without accountability has a way of convincing ordinary people they're untouchable until reality finally catches up. Looking back now, I realized the $15,000 fine was never the biggest threat. The real danger was believing authority never has to prove itself. If I had mailed that first payment instead of asking one simple question, 13 families might still be writing checks to people who never had the legal right to demand them. So here's the question I want to leave with you. If you'd been standing at that front gate holding the same violation notice, would you have fought it? Or would you have paid it just to make the problem disappear? Let me know down in the comments, because I honestly think that's where this story becomes bigger than one ranch or one HOA. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who believes paperwork doesn't matter. Sometimes the oldest document in the room ends up being the strongest weapon you've got, and sometimes the people who act the most confident are standing on the weakest ground of all. I'll see you in the next story.